Police don't need to stand outside your house anymore to watch what you're doing. They don't necessarily need a detective following you down the street either. Today, law enforcement can use an enormous network of cameras to monitor people from a distance, sometimes without the person being watched even knowing it is happening. And when you combine those cameras with facial recognition, zoom technology, vehicle tracking, drones, and other surveillance tools, police can potentially see far more than an officer standing on the street ever could. But here's where things get concerning. What happens when an officer watches you through one of these cameras, decides that something about you looks suspicious, and then sends police officers to stop you? What happens when that entire police encounter begins with something an officer thinks they saw on a screen hundreds or even thousands of feet away? That's not just a hypothetical situation. A case involving a man named Michael Celestine in New Orleans shows how quickly this type of surveillance can turn into a serious legal problem. According to the source material, Celestine was standing outside a friend's home when an officer watching through a surveillance camera claimed to see a bulge in his pocket. The officer believed that bulge could be a gun. That observation ultimately led to police approaching him, stopping him, and arresting him. And the consequences didn't end with the arrest. According to the account, Celestine spent more than a year in jail. The charges were eventually dropped, but he still lost his job, lost his freedom for a significant period of time, and suffered serious emotional consequences from being caught inside the criminal justice system. So here's the question I want you to think about throughout this video. When does police surveillance go too far? Because if an officer can sit inside a surveillance center, watch you from more than a mile away, zoom in on your clothing, decide that something looks suspicious, and then send officers after you, you have to ask whether technology is simply helping police enforce the law, or whether it is giving them a completely new way to create suspicion. Let's go back to what happened to Michael Celestine. Imagine you're outside on a cold winter day. You're standing near a friend's home, maybe smoking a cigarette or making a phone call. You're not running from anyone. You're not committing a crime. You're simply standing there. What you don't know is that someone is watching you. According to the source material, an officer was observing Celestine through a neighborhood surveillance camera from more than a mile away. The officer watched him for approximately 15 minutes. Then the officer zoomed in and claimed to see a bulge in Celestine's pocket. That single observation changed everything. Two police officers approached Celestine. According to the account, he panicked and ran. The officers pursued him, eventually used a taser, and he was hospitalized with injuries. Now ask yourself, what exactly did the officer know before deciding that this person needed to be stopped? The officer believed he saw a bulge, but a bulge isn't automatically a weapon. Someone wearing a heavy winter jacket can have a phone in their pocket. They can have a wallet, keys, a set of gloves. Anything can create a noticeable shape under clothing, and that's where the Fourth Amendment becomes important. Police generally need reasonable suspicion before conducting what's known as a Terry stop. A Terry stop allows an officer, under appropriate circumstances, to briefly detain someone when the officer has reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is occurring or that the person is involved in it. But reasonable suspicion isn't supposed to be nothing more than a hunch. The Supreme Court has explained that reasonable suspicion must be based on specific and articulable facts. In other words, an officer needs something more than simply saying, "Something about this person looked suspicious." And that's where surveillance technology creates a potentially dangerous problem. When an officer is watching a person through a camera, the officer is already separated from the situation. They're not standing next to that person. They're not hearing the conversation. They may not know what's happening outside the camera's frame. They're looking at a limited image and making decisions based on what they believe they're seeing. And if that officer decides the person looks suspicious, another officer may then arrive, and the situation can escalate very quickly. This creates what I call the surveillance suspicion problem. The camera sees something, the officer interprets what the camera sees. That interpretation becomes the reason for the stop. And then once the stop happens, police may begin looking for additional facts to justify what they've already decided. Now you might be thinking, maybe that's unfair to police. Maybe surveillance cameras actually make communities safer. Maybe officers need these systems to identify crimes and respond quickly. That's a legitimate argument. But when I looked deeper into how these systems are actually being used, the situation became much more complicated. The New Orleans Police Department entered into a federal consent decree in 2013. And according to the source material, federal investigators identified serious problems involving the department's policing practices. Those findings included allegations involving racial bias, unlawful stops, searches, and arrests, as well as concerns about officers' understanding of the limits of Terry stops. Now put that history together with a citywide surveillance system. You have officers who can watch large portions of the city without physically being there. You have technology that allows them to zoom in, track people and vehicles, and collect information from multiple camera sources. And you have officers deciding which people or situations deserve closer attention. That's where the concern becomes much bigger than one individual arrest. The more cameras you have, the more people you can watch. The more people you watch, the more unusual behavior you're going to find. And when officers are specifically looking for suspicious behavior, ordinary behavior can suddenly start looking suspicious. Think about the Celestine situation again. Someone is outside on a cold day wearing a puffer jacket with their hands inside their pockets. Could there be a firearm underneath that jacket? Sure. But could there also be a wallet? Absolutely. And there's another issue raised by the source material. Louisiana has laws addressing concealed firearm possession, and according to the account, officers acknowledged that they didn't know whether Celestine actually had a concealed carry permit. So the surveillance camera showed an image. The officer interpreted the image as potentially suspicious, and that interpretation became part of the justification for what happened next. But where was the officer actually watching all of this from? This brings us to one of the most important pieces of this story, the real-time crime center. A real-time crime center is essentially a centralized surveillance and intelligence operation where police can monitor camera feeds and other information from a single location, and this is where things get much bigger than a single police camera. According to the source material, New Orleans operated a surveillance network involving more than 1,000 cameras, including government-owned cameras and hundreds of privately owned cameras. Think about what that means. Instead of police having one camera at one intersection, they can potentially access an entire network of cameras positioned throughout the city. Some cameras belong to the government, some belong to businesses, some may belong to residents. And when these systems are connected, police can potentially have eyes in places where they don't have an officer physically standing. But the technology doesn't stop with ordinary security cameras. Modern surveillance systems can integrate facial recognition, drone footage, body camera footage, license plate information, gun detection technology, and other forms of data. Now imagine combining all of that. A camera sees you, another system identifies you. A database tracks where your vehicle has been. Another camera picks you up several blocks later. And somewhere inside a surveillance center, an officer may be watching all of this information appear on a screen. That sounds like something from a science fiction movie, but according to the source material, this type of technology is already being used in cities across the United States. New Orleans isn't the only city with a real-time crime center. The source identifies cities including Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Fort Worth among locations using similar surveillance operations. And some of these systems involve thousands of cameras. Now here's the privacy question that most people don't think about. Where does all this footage actually go? It isn't necessarily sitting on a physical tape inside the camera. A huge amount of modern surveillance footage is stored digitally, often through cloud-based systems. That means the footage can potentially be accessed, shared, requested, or retained through systems controlled by companies rather than the homeowner who originally installed the camera. And this brings us to another major issue. Your own security camera may become part of the surveillance network. Think about your Ring doorbell or another smart security camera. You bought it to protect your house. You wanted to know who was standing at your front door. You wanted evidence if someone broke into your property. But what happens when police want access to that footage? According to the source material, Ring acknowledged in 2022 that it had provided customer video and audio footage to law enforcement without obtaining the customer's consent in certain emergency circumstances. That distinction is extremely important. Police don't necessarily need to knock on your door and ask you personally if they can see footage from your camera. Depending on the circumstances and the applicable law, they may be able to seek information directly from the company that stores the footage, and that changes the entire privacy equation. Your camera may be sitting outside your home, but the footage may be stored somewhere else, and another organization may control access to that footage. And this is one reason smart camera technology has become such an important part of modern policing. Police departments have also encouraged businesses and residents to participate in these surveillance networks. The basic pitch sounds reasonable. If everyone has cameras, police can respond faster when crimes happen. A business sees something. A homeowner has footage. Police connect the footage together. Investigators can potentially reconstruct what happened. That can absolutely be useful when solving crimes. But there's another question we have to ask. What happens when the system stops being used only to investigate crimes that already happened? What happens when police begin using cameras to identify people they believe might be involved in criminal activity? That's where surveillance can move from investigating crime into something much closer to predictive policing. According to the source material, New Orleans originally presented its real-time crime center as a limited system that would be used in response to complaints coming through dispatch. Someone calls about a crime, police respond, then investigators look at the relevant cameras. That sounds very different from continuously monitoring an area and searching for people who look suspicious. But according to the account, the system eventually became associated with a much broader surveillance approach. And the consequences of that approach can be seen in another case involving a man named Clint Carter. According to the source material, New Orleans police used the city's live surveillance system during an investigation involving Carter. Officers allegedly watched him through the system, moved in, and searched him. The search reportedly found no drugs, but officers did find brass knuckles. Carter's charges were later thrown out by a judge, yet, according to the account, the arrest still created consequences for him because of his existing parole situation. And this is something people often misunderstand about the criminal justice system. Getting your charges dismissed doesn't necessarily mean nothing happened to you. You can lose your job, you can lose your housing, you can spend days, weeks, or months dealing with court. You can have your family life disrupted. And if you're already on probation or parole, even an arrest that doesn't ultimately result in a conviction can create additional problems. So when someone tells you, "Don't worry, if you didn't do anything wrong, the charges will eventually get dropped," that doesn't mean the experience is harmless. The damage can happen long before a judge ever makes a final decision. Now, supporters of these surveillance systems make an understandable argument. They say police need modern tools to fight modern crime. They say cameras can help identify suspects, locate missing people, respond to emergencies, and investigate serious offenses. And that's true. The problem isn't necessarily the existence of cameras. The bigger question is how police use them. If an officer uses a camera to identify someone who just committed a violent crime, that's very different from an officer watching an ordinary neighborhood and deciding that someone's clothing, behavior, or movements look suspicious. And there's a psychological problem here. If you place an officer behind a camera and tell them to look for suspicious activity, they're going to spend their time looking for suspicious activity. If the cameras are concentrated in neighborhoods that police already consider high crime areas, officers may encounter more people who they believe look suspicious. And the cycle continues. More surveillance creates more observations. More observations create more police encounters. More encounters create more opportunities for mistakes or constitutional violations. Technology doesn't automatically eliminate human bias. Sometimes it simply gives that bias a longer lens. And that's why I keep coming back to one principle. New technology can amplify old problems. Michael Celestine's situation and Clint Carter's situation both illustrate the consequences described in the source material. Even when criminal charges don't ultimately survive, the person still has to live with everything that happened before the case was resolved. And according to New Orleans public defender Matt Engelberg, these types of police reports were not isolated incidents. He described seeing reports involving people simply standing outside their homes or near their vehicles who were stopped for reasons that were unclear, eventually ending up with charges and sometimes becoming trapped in the system because they couldn't afford bail or were already on probation or parole. That raises a much bigger constitutional question. At what point does widespread surveillance become a search? And here's where the law gets complicated. Under the Fourth Amendment, the Supreme Court has traditionally looked at whether a person has a reasonable expectation of privacy and whether government conduct actually amounts to a search or seizure. The Supreme Court's decision in Katz v. United States established the familiar reasonable expectation of privacy framework. Under that framework, courts consider whether a person actually expected privacy in the thing or place being observed, and whether society is prepared to recognize that expectation as reasonable. And this is where public surveillance becomes difficult. If you're standing in a public place where anyone can see you, you generally have a much weaker expectation of privacy in what is openly visible. If a police officer is standing on a public street and sees you walking down the sidewalk, the officer doesn't normally need a warrant simply because they're looking at you. So what if the officer sees the same thing through a camera? That's where the legal analysis becomes more complicated. The Supreme Court has generally recognized that police observing things exposed to public view doesn't automatically constitute a Fourth Amendment search. The plain view doctrine can also allow officers to use evidence they lawfully observe when the necessary legal requirements are satisfied, but technology has created new questions that weren't nearly as significant when these legal rules were first developed. A human officer can only stand in so many places. A camera can be placed almost anywhere. An officer can watch one person. A surveillance center can potentially watch hundreds of cameras simultaneously. And technology can allow police to zoom, record, store, search, and combine information in ways a human officer simply couldn't. So the question becomes whether the law should treat all of that information the same way as an officer simply looking down a public street. That's an issue courts continue to confront as surveillance technology becomes more powerful. And there's another point we can't ignore. If these systems are supposed to make communities safer, do they actually reduce crime? According to the source material, research involving Detroit's Real-Time Crime Center received a no effects rating from the National Institute of Justice, meaning the surveillance system did not show a statistically significant effect on lowering crime rates in the evaluation being discussed. If that's accurate, Then we have to ask a difficult question. If a system dramatically increases the government's ability to monitor ordinary people but doesn't produce a meaningful reduction in crime, what exactly are we giving up in exchange? Because privacy isn't something you notice only after it's gone. You don't necessarily know when someone is watching. You don't know which camera captured you. You may not know how long the footage is stored. You may not know who has access to it. And you may never know that a police officer looked at you through a camera and decided you were worth investigating. That's what makes modern surveillance different from the police officer standing on the corner. The camera doesn't announce itself. The surveillance center doesn't announce itself. And you may never know you are being watched until the police suddenly show up. So what can you actually do about this? First, understand that seeing a police camera or knowing that your city has a real-time crime center does not automatically mean police have violated your constitutional rights. The legality depends heavily on where the camera is located, what information police obtained, how they obtained it, what they did with that information, and what legal justification existed for the subsequent police action. Second, don't assume that everything captured by a camera can automatically be used however police want. The Fourth Amendment analysis can become very different when surveillance involves private areas, prolonged tracking, technological enhancement, or information that you reasonably expected to remain private. And third, understand your own city's surveillance policies. Many people have absolutely no idea whether their local police department operates a real-time crime center. They don't know how many cameras are connected to it. They don't know whether businesses can voluntarily provide footage. They don't know whether residential cameras are integrated into the system. And they don't know what rules govern how officers can access that information. That information matters, because you can't protect a privacy interest you don't even know is being monitored. And this is why I want you to look into what your own city is doing. Find out whether your police department operates a real-time crime center. Find out what types of cameras are connected to it. Find out whether private businesses or residents can voluntarily provide footage. And most importantly, find out what policies are supposed to control how officers use that information. Because the technology isn't going away. Cameras are becoming cheaper. Storage is becoming easier. Artificial intelligence is becoming more powerful. Facial recognition is becoming more sophisticated. And police departments are gaining access to more information than ever before. The question isn't whether police will have access to more surveillance technology. The question is, what limits will exist when they do? Because when an officer watches you through a camera, decides that something looks suspicious, and sends officers to stop you, the entire encounter can begin before you even know someone was watching. And if the system is wrong, you may be the person who pays the price. Now, there's one more problem you need to know about. We've talked about police watching you through cameras. We've talked about police accessing private surveillance footage. But what happens when police take surveillance technology one step further and use it to look inside your home? Can police use technology to see through walls? Can they determine whether someone is inside your house without opening the door? And what happens to your Fourth Amendment rights when police can see things that would normally be completely hidden from them? That's exactly what we're breaking down in the next video. New tricks cops use to search your home when you're not there.